My name's David Fine. I'm a member of the Board of Trustees, and it's a great privilege to be associated with the centre, to work with extraordinary people that actually run the centre. I met the mother of David Jammy this afternoon, who was my school friend, who I haven't seen in a long time. It's really terrific, all the volunteering and also just the terrific administration and the work that people do. And I must just tell you, just coming before the introduction, that it's been an extraordinary week. We started in Johannesburg with a dinner here on Monday night, which was an extraordinary experience. We went then to Cape Town, and we were hosted by the Premier, and we had a number of events. We were in Stellenbosch, for some events, and, we're here today. And then tomorrow the Prince will, we also took him to Nando's, and there's an important reason. We took him to Nando's in Gardens in Cape Town. He liked the hot peri-peri, for anyone who's curious. He's clearly got some passion inside. Because tomorrow, in addition to him going to Orange Farm, Robbie Brosen will also take him on a private tour of Constitutional Hill. So quite a packed event. I think that the lesson that we draw from this centre, which is so critical today, and which to a certain extent brought the Prince here, and he'll explain that journey, how he ended up here at the centre. It all starts with small steps and choices. Small steps that we've all seen in the past that go down a pathway that lead to horrendous and unimaginable, horrific outcomes. But it always starts with small steps, small words, othering, and choices. And the interesting part, I think, of what you'll hear this afternoon is the choice he was confronted with. And what I've come to see is his extraordinary humanity and courage to actually make a choice. Of course, there are going to be criticisms. Could it have been earlier? Could he have done it? I mean, it's the reality of life. I have been subject to many criticisms myself. But I think it's about actually being courageous and taking those steps, and he'll talk about that. So without much ado, let me then briefly introduce him and Tali, for those who don't know Tali. So last year, Tali and I met with the Prince at his castle in Hohenzollern Castle, which is the private residence of the German royal family. And what's interesting when you go in there is you feel the 1,000 years of history. He can trace his family back 1,000 years, and there's a family tree that's painted inside it actually has to cover multiple walls of all the interesting characters. And you need to understand a little bit about some of the characters in his history, which perhaps you've read. He is a direct descendant of Queen Victoria. He's obviously a direct descendant of Kaiser Wilhelm II, and that has its history. Russian Tsar Nicholas II. And he told a beautiful story this week, which maybe he'll elaborate on, about how all of these royals got together at a time in 1913 and had a wonderful party and wedding. And 5 years later, what was the world? It was crazy. The monarchy in Germany had abdicated, the Russian Tsar had been murdered, and World War I had happened. So it's always interesting and you should explore this history, and you'll see that there are cards where you can send in questions, and then Tali will moderate those. The other thing is we always try and simplify history. We've had a lot of discussions this week. But the Prince had ancestors who were the first to give rights to Jews in Europe, land rights. He has a relative who suffered in a concentration camp because he was homosexual. He has a grandfather who was close to the German resistance and was actually part of the resistance that tried to assassinate Hitler in 1944. and failed his grandfather, but his great-grandfather, apologies, also actively collaborated against anti-democratic forces and did support Hitler. And that just gives you a sense of the complexity of history and family. A year ago, he declared, and I'm going to quote, "Anyone who panders to right-wing extremism cannot be a tradition setter for the House of Hohenzollern." And he concluded by stating that as head of the family, he would therefore renounce his claims to assets seized by the Soviet forces in 1945 that were legally associated with some of the problematic individuals. In simpler words, he relinquished a 400 million euro legitimate claim against the German government. He did not disown his family, and he'll talk about this. It's very personal to him. But through his courage, he defined what his family stands for. And so we'll hear a little bit from him, but it's a great privilege to be associated and to have spent time with the Prince. Great privilege to have him here. So I'm going to get him to come and sit up here before I introduce Tali. Your Highness, yep. And then let me introduce Tali before my voice finally gives up. For those who don't know Tali, she was born to a family of Holocaust survivors. Her father and uncle were saved by Oskar Schindler. And again, we talked and heard about this week, choices and steps. Oskar Schindler was a Nazi, made a lot of money, and made a choice at some point to save Jews, and Tali wouldn't be here today without that choice. She's an extraordinary person who just has amazing awards. I'm only going to read a few of them for you. In 2010, she was chosen as one of the top 100 newsworthy and noteworthy women in South Africa. She's won the Care Community Service Award in South Africa in 2015, the Gratias Agate Award from the Czech Republic in 2020, the Austrian Holocaust Memorial Award in 2021, the Goethe Medal in 2022, and the International Religious Freedom Award from the United States a few weeks ago. So, extraordinary person. The work we do is amazing. I'm not going to go on, otherwise I will fall over. So Tali, after you.
Thank you very much, David. It was wonderful to travel this week also with you, and my appreciation to you and the Board of Trustees for all you do. Today, of course, it's Human Rights Day, and we have to acknowledge it, especially here in South Africa. We'll speak a little bit more about it and about the amazing coincidence that the visit by His Royal Highness happened this week, this month, which is Human Rights Month in South Africa. So it is really a great honor to have you with us, Your Royal Highness, and we so appreciate you coming all the way to South Africa and to Africa. It is your first time in this continent, but hopefully not the last time. So thank you very much for coming here to join us in this special Human Rights Day.
Thank you very much.
And as David said, there are amazing people here from different walks of life, members of the diplomatic corps, friends, members, supporters. But I think you all agree with me that the most important people here are our Holocaust survivors. And we have Holocaust survivors sitting in the first and second row. And it is wonderful to have them today. Great honor to have them with us today. And what a surprise it was to see our architect of this magnificent center. Louis Levine and Clara, I see members of his team and the team that built here, Clara de Cruz Almera. And of course, you know that this week, 5 years ago, we opened the center. On the 19th of March, 5 years ago, we opened the center, and this is really indeed a reason to celebrate. Took us many, many years to create this award-winning building and exhibition, but it is wonderful to be here and to mark that day together with you. And as you heard, history is layered. David shared what many of you know, that I'm indeed the founder and director of this center. I'm a historian, but I'm also a daughter of Holocaust survivors. So everyone has layers and layers of identity. Everyone has layers and layers of history. And the word choices was already spoken about, and we'll talk a lot about choices today. Because, of course, my father, who was saved by Oskar Schindler, and me would not have been alive to create this center and to do the work without that choice. So those choices are happening, they're not easy, they have consequences, but creating this center is important because this center is a center of memory, education, dialogue, and where lessons for humanity are learned from difficult histories, such as the Holocaust, such as the genocide against the Herero and Nama in Namibia of today, such as the genocide that targeted the Tutsi in Rwanda, and of course, the genocide that targeted the Christian Armenians under the Ottoman Empire during the First World War. This center is working locally, nationally, and internationally, and it looks at many histories in a multi-directional way and connects them all to South Africa. And that brings us today, Human Rights Day, the connections to South Africa. How do we make those connections not only to the past, histories of colonialism or apartheid, of racism and othering, but also to today, history of xenophobia and the reality of xenophobia that so many of our friends are facing. And maybe lastly, before we start the conversation, it is a space of critical thinking, of nuances, where we encourage the visitors, you, our friends, to make connections between memories of the past and challenges today. And these are some of the challenges that we are going to speak about in a microwave. It was a very intense week, so excuse me. A micro way of looking at a family history, like I shared a little bit about my family history and the layers through Prince Georg Friedrich of Prussia's history, but also we will look at issues that are wider, societal, country, global, some of the lessons learned through his story about his family in the small way, but also the large way that he's representing. This week was amazing because we indeed started with dinners and meetings, but Prince Georg spoke to learners, 15 years old, 16 years old, 17 years old, from 4 schools in South Africa. He spoke to students at the University of Cape Town and to faculty members. And we spoke about memory, family, history, ethics, and leadership. We're going to speak about all that today in the past, but also in the present and hopefully future lessons. So again, welcome, and perhaps you can tell us briefly about yourself, about your family's history. Now, it is 1,000 years of history. So can we do it in an abbreviated podcast way?
Dear Tali, thank you very much. And maybe before I start elaborating on 1,000 years of family history for the next 2 hours, would you give me 30 seconds to thank you so much for having me here, for inviting me and taking me to this country, in fact, to this continent for the first time in my life. And I really have to say, this week, it's not even a whole week, but it felt like 3 weeks because of the schedule we had, and still the time passed much too fast, much too quick. And unfortunately, tomorrow I have to leave, but only to come back. I can promise you that already. And I would like to take the opportunity to thank you and to thank David so much for having me here, because although the many coincidences that brought us together 1.5 years, it was you who offered advice to me. We're going to talk about that later, maybe. And it was you who actually came to visit me at Hohenzollern Castle just after the 7th of October. And it was you who invited me here. So gladly I am here, and I have the great opportunity, this is like the great final of my visit, to be in this room with all of you, to share my thoughts, and also to be in this room together with 4 Holocaust survivors, which I'm deeply moved by, and I'm very thankful as well. So I'm very much looking forward to share the one or other thought and having a conversation with you, dear Tali. And I'm looking very much forward to that. So back to my family history. 2 good news. First of all, there is a short version indeed. And the second one is I'm not a historian. So I'm lacking all the knowledge to fill the whole evening with only family history. But the start, where the big bang of my history started, but on a very small scale, was already mentioned. It's the castle of Hohenzollern, and I was very happy actually to be told that in the audience there are people from Hechingen or from Sigmaringen, so some of you actually know that place, and they were even born and raised there. And it's not in northern Germany or Berlin-Brandenburg, where you would expect something that has to do with my family, but actually my family started in southern Germany. So the Hohenzollern Castle is situated somewhere south to Stuttgart, if you go by car, it's like an hour. And the first mention of my family is the year 1061. There are some documents where the first Hohenzollerns were mentioned. So it's not quite 1,000 years yet. But to cut this long story short, it was all due to my ancestors, who were rather skilled in a political way. It was much more their political skill in maybe marrying the right woman at the one or other occasion, much more than actually leading wars at that time in the early Middle Ages. So because they were that successful, they were later on given or provided with another office. They became Burggraves of Nuremberg. So there was a division. One brother stayed in the Swabian Alp, and he remained Catholic like all his other successors. And the other brother went to Nuremberg. And another 200 years later, they became Markgraves of Brandenburg. And in the succession and following, they also became Prince-Electors of Brandenburg. So they set foot in Brandenburg on 1415. And being a prince elector was not only prestigious, it was also a very important office because there were only 7 prince electors in the Deutsche Reich at that time. There wasn't a thing like Germany at that time. Since those prince electors were able to vote for the Kaiser, or for the emperor, that gave them quite a lot of power. Otherwise, Brandenburg at that time, it was a mixture of swamps and sand, so there was almost nothing to gain from except for this political position. And also there were some noble families who heavily resisted my family. So it's a very interesting story, this development, which then eventually ended in my ancestors becoming kings of Prussia, and eventually in 1871, also German emperors. And at that time, the state of Prussia, which has started as this mixture of swamps and sand and highly unsuccessful state, they created one of the biggest European powers, which even by area is far bigger, far larger than Germany is now. And it's very interesting if you project the state of Prussia in its largest extent to the map of Europe today, you actually see that it's not only Germany, but 7 European states and Russia and Switzerland who are actually affected by the history of my family. So I can proudly say that my family didn't only shape and influence the policy at that time, but also the cultural landscape, the society, and all this family history, which happened to be a German and European history at the same time. There are many traces we still have. And obviously, or to state the obvious, in 1918, after the end of First World War, my great-great-grandfather, William II, abdicated from the throne. And from that moment onwards, all of us became ordinary citizens like everyone else. And the members of my family coped with that in the one or other way. We might talk about this also a little later. My family doesn't have any political power anymore. We are not politically active, but I am proud to be the head of the Hohenzollern family, meaning that I'm representing my family, speaking on behalf of family members, and also taking care of our, we call it the house, meaning the family in an economic sense. And that's basically what I do, and I'm very proud of. Although, to state another obvious thing, it's like with physics, it's also the same applies to history. Where you have light, there's also shadows, and I think this is a very important matter as well and should be addressed as well. But overall, I'm happy and proud about my family's history, and I'm very happy to be here.
Thank you so much, Prince Georg. You became the head of the family in 1994. Yes. And we spoke about the connections of history. For us here in South Africa, 1994, of course, it's a very important year. Next month, we will mark the 30 years of our democratic existence after a long period of great devastation and suffering. We spoke about Rwanda. Rwanda also next month, 30 years ago, went into great genocide. So 1994 seems to be this year of change. Can you maybe just very briefly speak about how come you became the head of the family? You were very young. And what then does it mean a little bit today, just that people in South Africa will understand that, because it's not something that we know about.
Okay. Yeah, that's true. And I was born in 1976, so in 1994, when my grandfather died, I was 18. So legally, I was of age. I was a grown up. But in fact, even especially if I look at old pictures, I realized that I was a child at that moment, and it was actually very unfortunate, especially. It was unfortunate that we have this generation gap, because naturally it would have been my father taken this place. My father, he died very young, only being 33, which means it's rather strange for me having a father who never became to be the same age I am now, so I'm much older than him. So I always, gives me thoughts to overcome. But so my father died during a military exercise where he was heavily wounded in 1977. So I never actually met him. I was only 1 year old. And this is why when my grandfather, or the other way around, I was very happy and thankful that at least I could get known to my grandfather that intensely, and my grandfather tried to compensate as good as he was able to for the loss of my father. That was the reason why I was so young, becoming head of house. And the term head of house has been established actually after 1918, because Prussia wasn't the only former ruling house, or at that time ruling house. There were many others. In fact, before Napoleon came to Germany, there were more than 300 different families ruling, and each one, may it be small or extremely small, still there were sovereigns in their own principality. And later on, after it's a very difficult term, Reichsdeputationshauptschluss, the number was reduced to the major houses, including Bavaria, Hanover, Prussia, and some 20 others. But all these houses, of course, they always had a sovereign in their midst who was responsible for the state. He was ruling, but he always, so he was a public figure, but he also was a private figure, being in charge of the family, naturally. So when the monarchy ended and nobility was abolished in 1918 through the Treaty of Versailles, all the families continued in their dynastic thinking, so that there's always someone in charge. And so we might seem as a bit old-fashioned, because in all the families it's still the male heritage, the primogenitor. One might think of overcoming this, but since I have 2 twin sons as firstborn, so I can pass happily on this problem to the next generation. So what is left, since we are not in political power anymore, to me is to be in charge of the family and also representing the private part of our heritage, of our cultural heritage. And may it be the Castle of Hohenzollern, may it be the archives, our private archives, may it be our art collections, which we lend to especially the city of Berlin and to Brandenburg. May it be the foundation my grandparents left me or handed over to me. There is a clear division between everything that was state-owned and that was official, and between everything that this is private, which doesn't mean that there are moments, which I appreciate very much, where actually both come together. Like, for example, the 300th birthday of Friedrich the Great, who was like one of the most prominent ancestors I could name. There was a state act in Berlin, and the federal president was giving a speech, and there were many exhibitions taking place, and I was very happy that I was invited also to give a speech and to represent the family at that day. So there are many occasions where, both the public and the private part come together. And this is actually what I do, apart from several other ventures I also take care of.
And maybe we'll speak about that later. I want to go back to the light and shadow, and really what brought us together. So we met more than a year ago, first online, then in Germany. Of course, now you are here. But it's interesting for us sitting in Johannesburg to think how, why? How come we started speaking to each other, and how come we managed to assist somewhat, asking perhaps the right questions with a dilemma, a moral dilemma, an actual dilemma that you were facing for some years. And that is, of course, a dilemma that is connected to after the Kaiser, Willem II, abdicated, went to the Netherlands, of course, where he died during the Second World War in 1941, and is concentrating on the period of the 1930s and 1940s. So maybe can you share some of that history, but perhaps explain that dilemma in our coming together to try and help through it?
Yeah, this really is a very interesting question. How we have met due to so many coincidences. But the short version I have found for myself is simply that some things are simply meant to happen, and so this did happen, and I couldn't be more thankful for that. It all started 1.5 years ago. Actually, I might give you the greater picture, so I start earlier. There was a time where I started to be a bit more engaged with my recent history. Like in former times, I have been asked many times, are you an expert in your family history? Have you been brought up like when you were a child? Have you already been treated with family history? Did you get it with your mother's milk? And the answer is no. When I was a small boy, I was happy playing with matchbox cars and playing outside. And I was always been annoyed when uncles and aunts or great uncles came and confronted me with family history or with ancestors I've never heard of. And it's partly I felt ashamed, and partly I wanted to do different things. And there are pictures, actually, photos, official photos, where I was standing beside my grandfather, but you could still see how my hair was roughed up, and I have dirt in the face because my mother once more had me to drag out the bushes. So that's the truth behind it. However, a little later, I realized the value of what it means to get to know to family history and to know your ancestors a little bit more. And suddenly I saw it even as an advantage, because I realized, talking to friends or classmates, and I realized that they even struggling to know whether their grandparents had siblings, let alone who their great-grandparents were on both sides or on all sides. So I have the huge advantage and even luxury that the history of my family is literally an open book. I just need to go to the next bookstore or to consult the internet. And I just found out that ChatGPT is struggling very hard with the lineage. I don't know why, so I relate to the books more. However, that I think is something, can be something very important. So I started to read a lot and to become a little more self-confident when I was confronted with my family history. So I would know a lot about the German, the Prussian kings and the German emperors, maybe not so much about the very early Franconian ancestors, but I start to be occupied with them as well. And also, of course, I know a lot about my grandfather, the late Prince Louis Ferdinand, who I was able to get known to until I was 18. And he always served to me as an example, because he had a very moved life. Actually, he was born in 1907, the times of monarchy. So when he was a small boy, my great-grandfather, his grandfather, William II, abdicated. So there was, including the First World War, a very tenuous time, and actually the family wasn't sure what would happen to them when the Revolutionary Guards came and told them that they had to move from their home. Then he later on went to the United States, where he actually learned how a modern state looks like. And at that time, he actually became a convinced Republican and Democrat, even though he was a very traditional man his whole life. And later on, when he came back, when he had to come back, Second World War started, he was drawn into the Wehrmacht. And so there are many, many stories that are also the history of the 20th century. He had witnessed himself meeting very interesting people. There are also some sad chapters because he lost 2 children, or he had to bury 2 children, including my father. He lost his beloved wife very early, the late Kira, Grand Duchess of Russia. But at the end, like the kind of happy end on his 85th birthday, the 9th of November, the wall came down. So it was very, very interesting life. And so my grandfather also became one of these historic figures I wanted to learn more about and still want to. But at the end, there was a gap, and the gap especially expands over the mid-20s, 1930s and 1940s of our family history, and especially the protagonists of that time. And one of them was the father of my grandfather, who was William, the last crown prince. He never came into power. His father resigned, went to exile, and then there was his son, my great-grandfather William, crown prince, who also went to exile. Even this is a fact many people didn't know. So he also went to the Netherlands, but to another place than his father. And unlike his father, who stayed there for the rest of his life, my great-grandfather actually was allowed to return to Germany after he gave the promise never to get any political involvement, or not to involve himself into any political issues. A promise he didn't hold up to. And another reason why it was like a blind spot in the family history I know was that my grandfather didn't get on with his father. And therefore he didn't speak much about him. He didn't speak in a bad way. He just didn't speak at all about him. And in our family archives, I found letters between the two who haven't met after, or even during the course of the Second World War, and until 1951, they haven't met personally anymore. And I found letters where the father called his son a pig, and there were really difficult tensions between the two of them. So eventually, I didn't know very much about my great-grandfather. And neither did the German public, because the Kaiser, emperor. He was an interesting figure because he was a person of public interest, a historical person, and many biographies have been published by many very famous authors. But about my great-grandfather, there wasn't a single one. There were books mentioning him, but there wasn't a proper biography. And then something happened, and I try to make it as short as possible. After the reunification, which my grandfather witnessed himself, there was the chance for all the Germans who had lost their property in the Soviet sector, that was unrighteously expropriated, there was the chance to retain this property. It could be real estate, but also art, pieces of art. So like 800,000 other people, my grandfather filed for restitution, and hoping that one day or other we could get back maybe his family house, which happened to be at Sizilienhof, or the Marble Palace. In Potsdam, but there were, amongst others, were other houses which all were privately owned at the time when they were expropriated, because in 1918, where my great-great-grandfather abdicated, there was a long discussion between the state of Prussia and my family, what should belong to whom. And there was, of course, there was a civil list, but to some property it wasn't quite clear. So after 8 years, they found a solution. They made a clear cut. So everything that my family lost after 1945 was privately owned. And as such, my grandfather filed for restitution, hoping we could get back the one or other thing. Also, he was very attached to Potsdam since it was his hometown. And then another law was passed, also in 1949. Excuse me, in 94, very important, yes. In 1994, that actually put rules or should regulate how these restitutions, if it was possible, should happen. And it stated one certain rule. It said that the person being affected by those by disappropriation should, and the family who filed for these restitution claims, they shouldn't be restituted if their ancestor, in this case the Crown Prince William, had enabled National Socialism or communism. And so it took quite some time. In fact, it was 25 years. The public administration did some thorough research. And that was the time where I suddenly became aware that this great-grandfather, no one talked about it, no one was interested in, suddenly became the center of public interest, because it wasn't only the government administration that was becoming interested in his life, in his person, but also the media, historians, also lawyers and other people. So the public suddenly tried to shed light on his life. And it turned out that he, unlike his brother, he had a brother called Prince August Wilhelm, who in the time of 33 until 45 was very much or heavily engaged with the Nazi movement. He actually held speeches. He was member of the Nazi party. And he even was given a golden medal for being a member of the Nazi party for such a long time. That wasn't a secret, and I always openly talked about it, and it was very obvious. Whereas my great-grandfather, being the former head of the house, it wasn't so clear. He pondered with the Nazis, that was clear on the one hand, but on the other hand, he allied with his friends. One of them was the former Chancellor Schleicher, who also was a school friend of his, in order to find an alternative to Adolf Hitler and his movement. But then, on the other hand, my great-grandfather at one moment tried to be elected as Reichspräsident. He thought it was a good idea to be a candidate against Hitler and Hindenburg. But then his father, from exile, William II, he forbade him to do so. And being the head of the house at that time, he had the power to do so. And then my great-grandfather, a bit like an offended child, said, okay, then I don't want that anymore, but then I'm going to vote for Adolf Hitler. And even more, he gave an interview to a newspaper where he said, since I have given my vote to Adolf Hitler, and I say that in this interview, I probably would have given or helped Hitler to get 1 million votes, which was a clear case of overestimation, but still saying such things is something looking from now is, yeah, I would certainly put to the darker parts of my family history. And the problem arising from this huge historical debate, which was discussed in national but later on in international media, was linked to this law case. It was linked to this condition that he shouldn't have enabled National Socialism. And there was like an underlying rule or two rules that someone must have wanted to enable National Socialism. And the second point was one must have been successful in doing so. And by a legal point of view, one could have easily argued that no, he didn't want to have National Socialism, he wanted to restore monarchy. And secondly, yes, he gave these interviews. Yes, he was a part of the Day of Potsdam, the famous handshake between Hindenburg and Hitler. He was there, but he was there as a private person. And yes, he said stupid things, but as he was a private person, he didn't have the influence, the power to actually be successful or to contribute in a successful way. And at the end of the day, this conglomerate of judicial questions, historical questions, political questions, and also the boulevard interests of the media in my family, and the whole discussion put me into a moral dilemma, meaning that I was right, or all my lawyers and advisors told me we are on the right side and we have nothing to fear. But on the other hand, if you see the whole picture, it certainly was my great-grandfather and some others who brought the whole system down. He was not the only one, certainly not. But did he have a white coat? No, he didn't. So this dilemma didn't last for only one day. It occupied me quite a lot, and it kept me awake at night, of course. And now I'm leading over to the time when we have actually met, because the whole development I was accounting for, it started to become a public discussion in 2019. And then there was, of course, COVID, which put even more oil in the fire because people were happy to have a topic they could discuss. And at the end, I was looking for something, for someone actually to help me with my choice, to looking for an expert in choices without knowing actually I was doing so. And so that was the point, dear David, where we have met in Berlin. And we have met because you are a colleague of Dr. Nico Rabe, who is a friend of mine for more than 2 decades. So there was a pure coincidence that we met at this dinner and that we had the opportunity to talk afterwards at the bar. And we were talking about family issues. We were talking about my family issues and about the fact that I regard myself as someone who, to some extent, is defined by his ancestors and his family history, and everything he does or everything I do, to some extent, is defined by my past, the past of my family. And then you smiled and say, I know someone else who is defined by his family past and is very much into family history, meaning Tali. And you said, yeah, you should meet her. She's a friend of mine. And then you told me what she is doing, and I was very impressed even by hearing, dear Tali, what you are doing. And so we ended up in video conferences and about deep talks about moral decisions, about consequences, and how to overcome them. And to cut this very long story that only started 1.5 years ago, to cut it short, I made the decision almost exactly 1 year ago to renounce these claims, and I invited all the media. Some of them were treating me well all these years, some not so much, but I invited all of them for a big press conference where I made it officially, and where I also said that quote that you said, that someone who pondered with extremism and National Socialism in particular can't be the source of tradition in our house. And at the end I told everyone that I would let these claims be. And then actually I left the stage, and because I had asked several historians who had different views on that whole matter to actually have a debate. And for me, this was like the final line I could draw for myself, because I'm not, as I said before, a historian. I do not want to get engaged into the actual discussion. I only want to facilitate the discussion, and I still do, because the discussion actually goes on, and it has to go on. And so we opened our archives to everyone who's interested in that matter, and still many historians are involved into that discussion. And I asked one historian to write a book on the whole matter. So now there is a kind of a biography, and all the sources we used, we published in the internet. And so a lot has happened since then, and I haven't regretted this decision ever since.
Absolutely.
Thanks to you.
Thank you. Not an easy decision, not easy to confront your own past, certainly not easy to confront past that is difficult. And as we spoke many times, to find the gray, the middle, you know, it's not the black and white, but to actually confront the difficult decisions. So maybe share with everyone, you know, through the process, how did you feel? You know, a little bit about your feelings, and maybe your feelings today, and looking at the role of your great-grandfather, for example, but also others that were seen as leaders to one extent or the other, maybe not anymore heads of state, or, but still holding some leadership position. What does it tell you about leadership and the importance of values and ethics in leadership?
Maybe starting with the most difficult part of your question, with the feelings. I would be lying if there hadn't been any feelings. Of course, there are feelings. And of course, when you are occupied with your family history, the first thing that comes into mind is that you want to be proud of your family, that you are protective about your family, and that you want to talk about the good examples the family set. And of course, they were there. There were the bright moments of history that my ancestors were accountable for throughout the centuries. But as I said before, where there's light, there's also shadow. And as you said, and I fully agree, there's not only light and shadow in the sense of black and white, but there are many different shades, and that define us as humans. Therefore, I knew that when I started to look at my great-grandfather, William Crown Prince, who was a very difficult person to actually get, because he was so, how do you say, he did one thing on one day, but another thing in the other day, and these two things seem to contradict each other. Like, as I said before, pondering with Nazis, but on the other hand, being friends with many Jews, for example, and we didn't see a contradiction in that. So the process of getting known to an ancestors you have never met can be, and in my case it was, very painful. Of course, there would have been the easy way. The easy way would have been, or two easy ways actually, either to close one's eyes, to say, I don't care about them, and should others be occupied with that, or write thesis about it, about the topic, or books. But obviously that would have been too easy, and not an option for me in this position. And the other easy way some people also take is simply to create a villain out of the ancestors, to say he was evil, don't talk to me about him, it's like that, I move on. I think it's important to try to understand them, and this is the actual painful way, to try to understand what moved them at a certain time, especially in the times between 1900, the early 1920s until 1933, where the catastrophe was already perfect. Because many people in Germany already don't know anymore that it wasn't that someone just turned on the light and the Nazis were suddenly there. It was a development, and it was a way paved by choices. We all had choices, and this is the most painful to see when people like my ancestors or uncles or great uncles, they did have choices, and they chose a different way than we would have chosen. But then again, we know many things more. We know how it all turned out. And then you have to ask yourself the question, did they know at that moment? And unfortunately, with respect to my great-grandfather, there were certain decisions he took knowing what was going on. So that so much about this painful way of actually trying to get to know to someone I've never met, but still influences my life and the life of my family, my wife and my children, in a very severe way. But it was definitely worth it, and it helped me a lot of making the decision I have made. And now I'm very free to talk also about other members of the family, not only about the Prince August Wilhelm I had talked before, who was an obvious Nazi. I'm also open now to talk about my grandfather, who actually took this position in the military and especially political resistance of the ones who tried to overthrow Hitler on 20th of July 1944, because they were thinking ahead of the time, what will happen if we successfully kill Hitler? There mustn't be a vacuum. So they thought of a head of a state, and they asked my grandfather if he was willing to, and he actually accepted that, and another choice that actually put himself and his whole family, all of us, into severe danger. And he writes very impressively in his book about this chapter, actually at the end, after the unsuccessful attempt to kill Hitler, that actually the Gestapo showed up in his house in East Prussia, where he was living at that time. Therefore, that's something I'm now proud of. This was a very courageous choice, but I only can speak openly about it after I've made my own choice, because beforehand, everyone would have said, oh, he only puts his grandfather on display because he wants to have back his property, and he uses him like he might use his uncle who was put into a concentration camp for being a homosexual. But now I can speak about it openly, and I can try to understand them. And maybe in the long term, I can help the public to understand the imminent question, why and how did this all of this happen? Because I have a family where we have all the shades in one family, and representing all the different choices and attitudes towards such a system. And maybe in one day, to open the family history books and our archives, it might help to understand, like Tali, your center is trying to understand or to show not only the statistics, but also lives of people, to humanize it and to make it, to help us experience what people, the victims of that time, experienced. And so you have both sides. You have the victims and you have the perpetrators, and you have the many, many people in between. And since I represent a family who incorporates all of that, it might be a chance to contribute to answering that question.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. And in a world where extremism is on the rise, and leadership is not always what we would hope to, and we are worried about, perhaps speak a little bit about these lessons that for yourself you learned.
Yeah, maybe because you were asking about this aspect of leadership. This is, I think, something very interesting, because I always, being a bit naive when I heard the term leadership, the first thing comes to my mind is like a strong character, like who comes and in a military sense says, we go this direction, 1,000, and everyone can walk behind this guy, hoping it's the right way, and making clear orders or showing clear directions. And actually, now we live in times everyone is hoping for such a leader, and in some countries, actually, people are voting for such leaders. Maybe leaders we were emerging in the 19th century were defining themselves by pure strength and by pure authority, and maybe neglecting human rights. So this is a bad kind of leadership, and of course you weren't referring to that. If I look under the aspect of leadership to my ancestors, it's quite surprising that you hardly find this leader in a classic sense if you look at the Prussian kings or the German emperors or the prince-electors, because they were very differently. And just if you take, for example, the King Friedrich William I, the so-called soldier king, he might have been a bit of a leader in the classic sense. He was like a prototype of a Prussian. He saved every penny. He was very strict. He was a Calvinist. He was He followed all the typical, what was later to become Prussian virtues. And of course, he was strict to himself, he was strict to others. And when he was walking down the street and there was someone obviously not working, he actually took his stick and beat him up. So differently than today, where politicians have to be protected, actually the people had to be protected from that ancestor. But still, he was the one who laid the foundations for what later on was to become Prussia in the large scale. And he had his son, who was the complete opposite, Friedrich the Great, who was in his eyes very weak, and he preferred to play the flute and not so much to learn about military and strategic aspects. And he was a philosopher, and he had many things in mind, but nothing what his father would have liked him to be. And the interesting thing is that his father, the soldier king, even though he was called that, he never started a war. And then you have his son, the philosopher and the artist and the musician, who actually got engaged into the Silesian Wars. And he spent a great amount of time on the battlefield. And he was special because he even was one of the few absolute kings / leaders who actually went onto the battlefield, riding on the first row. And when you were at the Castle of Hohenzollern, you actually, I showed you the tobacco box that saved his life when he was shot from the horse. So many interesting aspects. But talking about leaderships, there were other ancestors of mine who were highly successful, also resetting the state of Prussia, for example, after Napoleon came and left Prussia in a very devastated state. Frederick William III, also one of my ancestors, he was leader at that time, but he wasn't like the one who took things in his own hands, but he was the one who listened to his advisors. He had very good advisors like Stein and Hardenberg, and who completely reshaped the society for the benefit of Prussia, and Prussia rose from the ashes again. And so there were many examples where there wasn't leadership in the classical sense, but maybe where there was the right person in the right place. I always remember the famous quote from Emperor William I, who said it's very difficult to serve as an emperor under Bismarck, but still he was able to listen at the right moment. So nowadays, what I actually wanted to say is, rather than searching for this strong authoritarian character, I think it's much more important to look for people who are not leaders in a classical sense, but who inspire people, who are able to encourage people to make those difficult choices. And sometimes they are the opposite of this classical leader. And I have one person in mind, and then I stop. I'm very proud and I feel very blessed that I could make friends with Margot Friedlander, who is a lady. She is 102 years old now, and she is a Holocaust survivor. She was in Theresienstadt, and she was 20 years at that time. And her story was as horrible as it was for all the other Holocaust survivors and everyone who had been to concentration camp. In her case, she had lost all her family. Her brother and her mother were murdered. She had to go to the underground, blaming herself that she didn't join her mother, that she didn't stay with her brother. And at the end, she had been betrayed and taken to Theresienstadt. And for some coincidence, she survived, and she met her husband in Theresienstadt. They married, went to New York, and never came back because he didn't want to set foot on German soil which is completely understandable after what they had endured. However, when Mr. Friedlander had died, Margot Friedlander returned to Germany because of a documentary that was filmed about her life, and she agreed to participate. And shortly afterwards, because she always regarded herself as a German, even more than she regarded herself as Jewish, she decided to move back with 88 years. And ever since, she lives in Berlin, and almost, I'd say, twice, 3 times a week, she goes to visit schools and goes to visit universities and going to talk to large groups of people about her life, what she had endured, but not to let out her anger on all the people, on the Germans, but in the opposite, to encourage them to be very observant and to take care that these things will never happen again. And I was very fortunate that my son organized a meeting with her in his school. And I said, yeah, if you want to, I can ask Margot Friedlander, but you have to organize it yourself, which she did. So that took place just 5 days ago. And I remember the students were asking her whether she would forgive us Germans. And then she looked into the audience and said, whom should I forgive? You weren't born, and what happened did happen, and we can't change it, as sad as it is. But all you sitting here, you are the ones in charge. You can take care that it will never happen. And it was so impressive to see young students in the age between 11 and 15 who can't sit still for 5 minutes normally, just being didn't move, and it was complete. You could hear a needle falling down. And she said, it's up to you that this will never happen again. And I think this is the kind of leadership we have to look for. And this is the kind of leadership you're showing here. And so I can only wish for that we have many more of those, even though, as we all know, we do not have so many witnesses anymore, but then we need people who get inspired by such people who then again inspire others.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And indeed, we are proud of our survivors, Irene from Poland and Irene from the Netherlands, and Adi. Maybe I'm missing others. Forgive me, I can't see to the end. But your message always is a message of love, and a message of learning, and a message of lessons. And that is the kind of connections that you made. Time is almost running out, and I do want to include some of the many questions that we received as we invited people to send the questions. I will be able to send you all of them, just that you will know the kind of feedback and messages that were received and questions received. But I chose maybe 1 or 2 that you can perhaps reflect on. Many of them you actually answered through your talk. So you spoke. Jean Boissa asked about the world and what can we see in leaders and how do we see leaders, and thank you for that. Maybe I'll look at the questions, many questions, but maybe choose the question of Nosipo Hani, who asking about your own journey of reconciliation. Do you think that can be an inspiration for young people to start looking at their family histories, to acknowledge family histories, and to addressing a world that is many times not equal, has many challenges, many issues. So maybe let's take this one.
Well, I think this is easier said than done, because as I told you before, my family history is an open book, and others do not enjoy that luxury of just opening a book and then knowing everything about their ancestors. But what I think I notice in Germany, and maybe that's happening all over Europe and in other parts of the world, is that there is a certain lack of historical awareness. And of course, historical awareness starts with one's own family. You can be interested in your family and your ancestors. And actually, it starts with, you don't need to open a book. It starts with oral history, which is always there in families. And if you ask your parents or grandparents, they will then take you further back in time. And it's very surprising, actually, how far you can get back. For instance, I had a very old aunt, or she was very old when, as far as my memory starts. And actually, I spoke to her, and she again knew, her grandmother, that's why, her grandmother of this old aunt knew a lady who actually participated in Hofbälle, in balls, the great celebrations hosted by Frederick the Great. So just by one handshake, I can cover almost 3 centuries, or let's say 2.5. So that's an extreme example, but what I was going to say is that, of course, it's worth talking to ancestors, to even to parents, and maybe to get known to your own family, and with it to your own history, because I have the impression that many people do shy away from history. Some even become aggressive against history. You see it when you see monuments being destroyed for whatever reasons. I do not want to comment so much on that, but it shows that there are tensions, there are feelings, and for example, when there was one event, I can't remember what it was, taking place in Stuttgart, there's a monument of my 4 times great-grandfather on a horse. And I would say, amongst all the many ancestors I do have, with all the lights and shadows, he's the one who could get away with most of it, because he was not that controversial like others. He was the first emperor. That was the one who said it's difficult to serve under Bismarck. He wasn't really comfortable being an emperor, but it was a time of prosperity, and so the only thing maybe you could criticize about him was the so-called cultural battle, where it was against the Catholic Church, which was a thing of Bismarck. However, to make it short, when there was this event, I think actually it was a church event taking place in Stuttgart, so there were thousands of people on the place, they covered this memorial, and there was a huge discussion why they did it, what was the reason, and then the short answer was, yeah, we do not want to have our guests being molested by our troubled past. But this is something I regard as the easy way, the too easy way, because it shows that we do have troubles with our past, which is we should have, absolutely, but we shouldn't choose the easy way of just literally put a blanket over it. Yeah, because you could ask, why did they cover the horse? I mean, it's so, which was also covered. However, I think to find to put it into words, I think there is a link between how we treat our parents or grandparents, altogether our ancestors, and how we treat our history. Because through our parents, we are what we are. We can't help it. We simply are. And of course, we can neglect them, we can lie about them, we can choose to move away from them, never to see them again, but they remain our parents, our ancestors, and they define us. We are what we are because of them. And the same applies to history, to our common history. And this is why, coming back to your questions, if it is possible that I can inspire others to also take that path of looking at their own history, even if it's simply by talking to parents, then I would happily do it. Yes.
And thank you for that. There are many, many questions about German history. Of course, you are not a historian or political personality, but just to be aware that there are questions about Germany's colonial past, there is questions about today, about wars, Ukraine, Israel, Gaza, many, many other questions. But I think let's finish with one question that is really interesting for me, and that is your role as an individual that is working with youth. You have your foundation, you use the arts, you use theater, you know, to bring reconciliation, and maybe it's not reconciliation, is not the right word, but bring people together to try and speak to each other. So the question was maybe to speak a little bit about other ways where we can bring people together. And I thought maybe you can end with the example of your foundation.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much for that opportunity, because the foundation of my family, that is the so-called Princess Kira of Prussia Foundation. It was founded by my grandparents just after the Second World War. My grandparents, they had been refugees themselves, because, as I said before, they lived in East Prussia, and when the Red Army arrived, they had almost overnight to leave everything behind to take their small children, like my father, who was only 1 year at that time, to take everything they could grab and then to flee towards Western Germany. They had to go over frozen waters, and there was one incident where actually a Russian tank was shooting behind the track, just maybe to hit one of them, but they were lucky, so they got out and everything was fine. But since they endured quite a lot, like millions of others, once they arrived in Western or Southwestern Germany, they decided for themselves, once we are better off again and we rebuild what has been left to our family, then we want to help others. And with that in mind, they created that foundation. And it's also important maybe to know that my grandmother had been a refugee twice, because she already had the same when being a Grand Duchess of Russia, when she was a young girl. She witnessed the October Revolution, where the Tsar and his family, as David accounted for, had been brutally murdered. They managed to escape as well, and they had to flee for the Red Army already. So this being refugee, this was something that occupied my grandparents quite a lot. So they created this foundation with the aim to help children who have lost their homes, and to some extent have lost parents, and who were entrapped in Western Berlin, to enable them to have holidays at the castle, at Hohenzollern Castle. And for that, they created rooms within the castle compound, a bit like a youth hostel. And in 1951, the first group actually arrived. And very interesting, in order to raise money for that, my grandfather gave a concert, because he also was a composer. And so in 1951, the first group arrived from Berlin, a group of boys, later on a group of girls. And so that continued, and it still continues until today. And the only difference is that because of the severe but also positive changes we had in between, like the fall of the wall, and that Germany at a certain time was not anymore at a post-war time, we could expand the purpose of the foundation. And so we didn't only invite children from Berlin, but also from all over Germany, from unified Germany, and also for special projects from abroad. We also had children from New York, from Russia, from Ukraine, from all over the world. And there was one special project that means a lot to me. We started some 20 years ago, where we invited students from Israel, students from Palestine, students from the United States and from Germany, all together, like 24 maybe. And that's the maximum number we could fit into the hostel in the castle. And it's very nice because the Castle of Hohenzollern, which is situated very nicely, very picturesque, you can have a group there, and actually you can lock them in, but they don't feel imprisoned. They just feel safe. And the good thing is there is not so much to do at the evening. You have like a guard walking around, and they are all to themselves. And what we did was to provide them with a very special task. And the task was handing them over a huge piece of paper, like this, a white piece of paper, and ask them to create a musical. They had 2 weeks' time, and they had to take care about everything, about the music, about the costumes, about the stage, about the storyline, most important. And at the end of those 2 weeks, there was a huge audience. There was 300 people at Hohenzollern Castle, and they later were brought to Berlin, 600 people watching. And I think this puts a considerable amount of pressure on these young people. We did it several times. And the interesting thing was that each group obviously had an issue with the other. If it was Germans and non-German Jews, if it was Palestinians and Israelis, if it was Palestinians and people from the US. So there was a lot of tension, but it was so nice to see that they left that tension away or beside, even if it was due to that task. And they accomplished that task. It was all the times we did it, it was like 5 times. It was always a huge success because the audience was not only moved by the fact that there were now students standing together on a stage that might have been hostile to each other, but they were moved by the play, by the storyline, by what they did. And the audience wasn't able to differentiate who was from Germany, who was from, I don't know, Haifa, Jerusalem, Ramallah, whatever. So that this is very touching and actually taught me and my wife and my whole family and the audience as much as maybe we were able to give to them. That it's possible that people can accomplish great things, even if the setting is so horrible as it is. I mean, now it's again a different story after what happened on 7th of October, but even beforehand, you had the wall, and you were talking to the one group, maybe of the Israelis, who were telling that since the wall is there, they can live much more secure and they don't get these bomb attacks and all these things. And then you talk to the other side, and you had this the other side who were telling you since the wall is there, they have the trouble not being able to work. And so, and to some extent, you could understand them as well. And this is what it makes so difficult. And including the fact that we Germans have the special issue where we actually are not entitled to comment at all. And this is why when we do these special projects, we do not interfere. We just enable, we provide, in this case, the rooms, the castle, and we provide the white piece of paper. And then we leave everything to the group and to my friend Todd Fletcher, who is the art director, who composes or helps to compose the music and so on. And so at the end, the experience is that it is possible to accomplish something and not to make any, to sacrifice your own view. And this is something I hope others might inspire. And of course, what happened on 7th of October makes it nearly impossible to repeat this as we did it before. But still, we are going to have a project like this where we ask young people, maybe living in Berlin, we go to Jewish schools, we go to schools where you have the majority are Muslims, and we ask Germans. So we will do something like this again with the same idea and hope for the best. And maybe that these things work, that the foundation does something that is nachhaltig, sustainable. We saw when last year we had our 70 years celebration, and we were visited by Professor Sietsma, and Professor Sietsma was in the first group that came in 1951. He was a participant, and he was in his mid-80s. He came in a wheelchair, and he became a professor for history. And after I asked him how this happened, about his biography, he said, yeah, because at that time it was my grandfather who was there, and he was so impressed by the history that he read a book at the time. He was actually at the castle, so that at the end of the week, he was the one who could show my grandfather around and the rest of the group and tell him about Prussian history. And that had stayed, and that had a great impact on his life. So in general, I would say we shouldn't underestimate our choices, shouldn't underestimate the impact we have on other people, because sometimes the impact will reveal itself much, much later. So I would say we shouldn't give up. Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Before I'm handing to you, just to say, David and myself saw a group of refugees at the castle in our visit, and it was indeed something that I will never forget. It is continuing, and the work needs to continue. And thank you for your support of our work at the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center, and thank you all for coming to listen to Prince Georg's story. And
thank you very, very much.
And I will take 10 seconds. Tali is going to be so happy next week when she doesn't have me to manage her, because it's been quite a process. So we need to get to another event. Sorry if we're going to close things. I just want to thank everyone for coming. I also want to thank Mark Klein. Please stand up, wave a hand. Mark Klein Productions, who always comes here and contributes for the center. And so it's just terrific. Thank you so much. And I hope that was provocative and made you think, and maybe spend a bit of time afterwards talking to each other and having a look at the exhibit together. Thank you.